Welcome to the channel. Probably a lot of people wonder how this seemingly amorphous structure known variously as a cabal, the deep state, or I sometimes call the international deep state, which is more accurate but not completely accurate. How do they maintain control and sort of guide the agenda into such an irresistible extent, apparently? And the secret to this goes back to the Venetian Republic, where these techniques, I think, were pioneered, at least in what you would call the age. Let me go back. The Venetian Empire was always somewhat vulnerable, not having the strongest army. And in the War of the League of Cambrai, the powers of Europe had finally decided they'd had enough of Venetian usury and financial shenanigans and manipulation and getting their economies crashed, and they had had enough, and they ganged up and they formed the League of Cambrai, and they were all going to descend on Venice and the bankers and tear them to pieces and have peace and progress in Europe for once, or at least in a long time, centuries of, couple of centuries, 3 centuries perhaps, of Venetian usury. At the last minute, they played upon the avaricious nature of the Pope, and they were able to make a deal and save their hides temporarily, but they realized their vulnerable position, and they began to transfer the tremendous funds they had built up, the fondi, the oligarchical families had accrued, and they transferred a lot of this north to Geneva, to Amsterdam, and finally to London. And what they realized was, very early on, if you could control how people think about things, if you could control how people viewed themselves and viewed reality, you could pretty much have your way in the world. So they realized that epistemological warfare would get them everything they wanted without having to risk their necks in battle, which would not be a good bet in their case. And the British picked this up because, as I said, the Venetian method was transferred to London ultimately, and you see the growth of the Venetian party through the Whig party in the British government. They called themselves the Venetian party. And then you see a modern iteration of this tactic, or this understanding, in when the British, when they realized that territorial control wasn't paying off, and they seemed to be losing ground and losing control in the old-fashioned sense of empire. They realized the empire of the mind was the way to go, and through manipulating mass media and messaging, you could control the entire world and get everyone on the same page. And a lot of this comes out of the Imperial Press Union. I think in 1909 there was a big conference that was held outside of London, where 600 of journalists from around the world were invited to a banquet and a symposium, and they were told, the world is a very dangerous place, very chaotic, and we need to make sure that we're all on the same page, we're all messaging the same thing, and we're all have an understanding about what people need to believe. So then the awareness was, people generally believe what they see in mass media, what they believe in newspapers. And then, of course, then you see just before World War I, the need to bring the British and American publics along for the ride in what was to be a horrible, unconscionable war based on nothing, ultimately based on lies. How did they get the American and British public to go along to support a war with Germany, which nobody really wanted, nobody could see the point of it? Well, there was an extension of British psychological warfare operations called Wellington House. It was called the Lie Factory. And they whipped up a very potent cocktail of propaganda that inflamed the public against the Germans that they supported this war that has been probably the biggest tragedy of modern times, something from which we haven't really recovered. And out of the success of that came the formalization, the institutionalization of this potential, of this capability in Tavistock. And if you're curious, there's a great book by Dr. John Coleman, which you can download for free, a PDF, Dr. John Coleman on Tavistock. I recommend it highly, and he goes into World War I extensively, and it's really heartbreaking as he breaks that down as to how that was done, and when he makes people aware of the tremendous, almost incalculable loss of humanity through that bloodbath. So, of course, Tavistock is still chugging along today, determining the narratives that will be promoted in academia and media, sets the tone and the messaging in the intelligence community. Tavistock agents coming from London transplanting this outlook and this method very closely intertwined with psychoanalysis. And so that's what we'll get into here, the more recent manifestations of Tavistock. And then I'd like to do several videos about Tavistock, some of the uglier, more perverse and just absolutely disgraceful operations. But let's get into this now. It's a bit long and I've gone on already, but I just want to give people a taste. I know probably the people that watch this channel already know a good deal about Tavistock. Empire of the mind. Fascinating, because I think the mind is the final frontier, and we all need to understand the tremendous, the infinite potential of our own minds and take the reins ourselves. Otherwise, we're going to be led around. We talk about normies, we talk about being red-pilled, blue-pilled. So much of this understanding, it's inaccurate in many ways, but not able to really drill down to specifics of how all of this consensus thinking and messaging is organized, and it's organized from a very specific place with very specific terms that are seeded into the mass consciousness and the general public discourse by Tavistock. These terms that are introduced, and these strange movements that crop up out of nowhere that have the appearance of being organic movements but are not. In fact, they're concocted. So let's get into this Tavistock Imperial Brainwashing Project by L. Wolfe. This is from Executive Intelligence Review, again, volume 23, number 22, May 24th, 1996. Various types of belief can be implanted in many people after brain function has been sufficiently disturbed by accidentally or deliberately induced fear, anger, or excitement. Of the results caused by such disturbances, the most common one is temporarily impaired judgment and heightened suggestibility. Its various group manifestations are sometimes classed under the heading of herd instinct and appear most spectacularly in wartime, during severe epidemics, and in all similar periods of common danger which increase anxiety and so individual and mass suggestibility. That's from Tavistock Institute psychiatrist Dr. William Sargent's 1957 book, Battle for the Mind, which you can also download for free. Easily done. I think that, next quote, I think that the subject will be of most importance, but I think the subject that will be of most importance politically is mass psychology. The social psychologists of the future will have a number of classes of school children on whom they will try different methods of producing an unshakable conviction that snow is black. Various results will soon be arrived at. First, that influences of the home are obstructive. Second, that not much can be done unless indoctrination begins before the age of 10. It is for the future scientist to make these maxims precise and discover exactly how much it costs per head to make children believe that snow is black. When the technique has been perfected, every government that has been in charge of education for more than one generation will be able to control its subjects securely without the need of armies or policemen. That's from the great humanist Lord Bertrand Russell in his 1951 book, The Impact of Science Upon Society. The late former Foreign Minister of Guyana, Dr. Fred Wills, once said that most of the diplomatic corps of the former colonies of Great Britain spent too much time trying to perfect their Oxbridge accents. The rest of the time, he stated, they spent searching, quote, for a British rump to kiss. Trying to explain this behavior to his American friends, Wills said that colonialism still exists in its most powerful form as a state of mind, quote unquote, of the subject people, even if the former colonies have been given their nominal freedom. Wills was commenting on the success of the long-term project of the British imperial elite, effectively keynoted in remarks by Winston Churchill to an audience of Anglophiles at Harvard University on September 6, 1943. Churchill was often locked in battle with U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who had, on several occasions, made clear his intent to dismantle the British and all other empires at the conclusion of the war. While refusing to concede American authority to impose a post-colonial solution on the empire, a consensus emerged in the imperial elite among the families closest to the royal family that the old imperial structures could not be continued. To maintain control, it was proposed to shift the battlefield away from control of territory to control of the minds, not merely of the colonial peoples, but of the United States and the rest of the Western world. In his remarks, which were broadcast internationally, Churchill proposed that his Anglophile allies within the United States join with their mother England in a new enterprise. It is our two countries, he said with his typical pomposity, that control the destiny of the world, who control science and technology, who control culture. These are weapons far more potent than military power, Churchill declared. To control what men think, quote, offers far better prizes than taking away other people's lands or provinces or grinding them down in exploitation, although they continue to do that, right? The empires of the future will be the empires of the mind, unquote. Churchill's secret weapon in this battle for the mind was an elite group of brainwashers and psychiatrists, then operating in the Army's Directorate of Psychological Warfare under the command of Brigadier General John Rawlings Rees. These were the cadre of the Tavistock Clinic. Based in London suburbs, they had already built a network of co-thinkers in the United States and various university locations, including Harvard and wartime operational bases within the Office of War Information and the Office of Strategic Services, OSS. In addition, Britain's psychological warfare warriors had established a beachhead in Hollywood in the emerging radio, television, and motion picture industries. At the end of the war, the Tavistock network, which numbered several hundred individuals, re-entered civilian life but remained under the central command of British policy circles. They proceeded to spawn numbers of think tanks, institutes, and other nodes. Tavistock's term for its various allied centers of activity in every part of the globe, dominating every key aspect of social policy. Today, the Tavistock core group numbers in the several score thousands. That core group, in turn, has trained close to 1 million cadre by their own estimates, who serve as teachers, advisors, and advisors to nearly all business, military, political, and educational elites, in ways subtle and some not so subtle, operating as a conspiracy intervening on individual human consciousness. They have attempted to not only shape what people think, but to establish the parameters and limits of thought itself. What is Tavistock? The Tavistock Centre, located in buildings in the London suburb for which it is named, is composed of the Tavistock Clinic and the Tavistock Institute for Human Relations, which in turn has 5 component institutions. Over the last 5 decades, it has founded a network of international nodes, which function as mini Tavistocks and are involved in joint projects. Its quarterly journal, Human Relations, published since 1947, serves as an effective briefing for the network on its more public work. The Tavistock Network owes its origins to the 1920 founding of the Tavistock Clinic under the direct patronage of the royal family through His Royal Highness Duke George of Kent, 1902 to 1942. The clinic soon earned the nickname the Freud Hilton for its promotion of the pseudoscience of psychoanalysis. However, it quickly broadened its horizons to include various other psychological theories. Unifying all of its theoretical studies was the oligarchical view of man as beast, whose impulses and urges could be controlled and tamed as one does with animals. So that should remind a lot of us, should remind us of this miscreant at the World Economic Forum, what's his name, Yuval Harari, who said that humans are now, can be understood now definitively as hackable animals. So this mentality does go back for many centuries. This was the view of the Venetians, that there is no soul, that we are basically biological machines. Tavistock's usefulness to its imperial masters can be gleaned from the work of its leader, John Rawlings Rees. A virulent race patriot and believer in eugenical theories, Rees had studied war neuroses, shell shock, in France during World War I. His conclusion: under controlled conditions, neurotic behavior could be induced, and through these methods, individual behavior could be absolutely controlled. In later years, Tavistock operatives such as Dr. Kurt Lewin would elaborate on Rees's discovery and develop methods for inducing controlled irrational behavior by groups of people. Tavistock, through Rees and others, proposed that its theories be put in service as a means of social control during times of peace. In his 1945 book, The Shaping of Psychiatry by War, Rees reported that the work of the Tavistock group during the war demonstrated conclusively that there was a psychopathological tenth of the population who were genetically dullards. These dullards, should their numbers not be controlled, would soon dominate civil society. It were therefore necessary to devise methods using psychiatry to control such people and prevent their increase in numbers, and to control their even larger populations in backward colonial lands that threatened the civilized world. Of the remainder of the population, there were some people who, if their neuroses could be controlled, might be useful to the very small group of people whose genetic breeding and psychological training allegedly suited them for leadership. For Rees and Tavistock, the job of psychiatry was to conduct the selection process by which society was divided and responsibility doled out among the dullards, the useful neurotics, and a genetically determined superior 10% at the top. Psychiatrists, Rees said, must be involved in all levels of society, prepared to intervene at any place, the home, the job, the school, at any time. If we propose to come out into the open, wrote Rees, and to attack the social and national problems of our day, then we must have shock troops. And these cannot be provided by psychiatry based wholly on institutions. We must have teams of well-selected, well-trained psychiatrists who are free to move around and make contacts with the local situation in their particular area. Unquote. Rees's book was based on a series of lectures that he gave to his networks in the United States. Within 2 years of the book's publication, Tavistock had expanded its operations in Britain and the Empire and enlarged its beachhead in the United States. To the Tavistock Clinic was added the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations to train and deploy the teams of mobile psychiatric shock troops. In the United States, Lewin's Research Center for Group Dynamics, the spin-off of National Training Laboratories, and the Institute for Social Research at the University of Michigan were all established. Money poured into this effort from royal family-sponsored charitable trusts, as well as from the Rockefellers, the Mellons, and the Morgans, to name a few of the U.S. oligarchical families whose pockets opened to the Tavistock brainwashers. It's plugged in. Restructuring the empire. The British elites tapped their Tavistock network to play a critical role in the post-war restructuring of their empire and its transition into the Commonwealth. In 1947, as the Tavistock Institute was being created, Rees was moved into the United Nations apparatus, creating the World Federation of Mental Health along with Montague Norman, the leading banker of the British Crown and the man who had maneuvered Hitler and the Nazis into power. This he did when he was the governor of the Bank of England. Really, he was in charge of making sure that the early Nazi Party had enough funds to rise. Rees helped create more than 36 affiliated organizations around the globe, with each promoting his neo-Freudian racial selection theories and targeting and selecting local elites for British patronage. Meanwhile, he collaborated with Sir Julian Huxley, then heading the UN Economic, Social and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, in devising programs to assist the selection of leadership cadre within the colonial sector for special training. The UN bureaucracy itself was similarly infested with Tavistock-type group training programs to indoctrinate and control whatever cadre were sent through its mind mills. Fred Wills described the UN bureaucracy as, quote, the world's longest continuously run brainwashing program, unquote, for developing sector leaders. Those who entered it, if they indeed ever came out, had lost all touch with reality. At the same time, we see that, of course, today with people like Trudeau and Macron and the WWII clowns. When these methods of control failed, as they often did, the British Crown turned to the same Tavistock psychological warriors to devise methods for creating controlled terrorist movements, quote unquote. Tavistock operatives assisted army units in the creation of what were called gangs and counter-gangs in the colonial sector. The technique was laboratory tested by Brigadier General Frank Kitson in the 1950s in Kenya, where brainwashing and torture were used on prisoners in British POW camps to create phony British intelligence-controlled units of the Mau Mau insurgency. Legitimate national liberation movements fighting to win freedom from the British yoke were penetrated and broken their leaders killed, ostensibly by quote-unquote rival factions. In 1970, Kitson was sent to Northern Ireland, where he, not the Irish Republican Army, launched an urban murder and bombing spree that triggered a quarter century of violence and psychological terror. Following Rees's departure from Tavistock, the man who ultimately took charge of the network was a Rees protege, Eric Trist. Trist's primary assignment was to expand Tavistock's operations in the United States. But first, he launched a major Tavistock project, management training. In quote-unquote Tavistock, operational research, quote-unquote. With the approval of the highest circles of the British elite, Tavistock's brainwashers were contracted by the Empire's corporate entities to restructure their management and workforces from within. One section of this was targeted at breaking the power of trade unions by inducing them to become part of management teams. Co-participation. But by far the largest component of these operations placed management itself through group profiling and therapy-like sessions to force higher productivity, that also in quotes. Among the corporations put through this brainwashing were Shell, Unilever, the British government-run coal industry, and several major financial institutions. Today, most major corporations have staff psychologists or contracts with them, while corporate meetings are often run by a group leader called a facilitator hired for the task. Post-industrialism as neo-colonialism, which is just, as I conceptualize that right now, it's a way to sort of head off the inevitable rise of colonial nations wishing to develop themselves. Inevitably, they're going to do that. So how do you head that off? Well, you shut down industrialism so that they don't go there. And if they were to really develop and get on track, then of course they would challenge the imperial powers for resources, etc., and for political power. Okay, post-industrialism as neo-colonialism. Writing in a 1990 Tavistock anthology titled The Social Engagement of Social Science, Trist laid out Tavistock's current mission statement. All nodes express the philosophy of the social engagement of social science. The engagement is with meta-problems that are generic and field-determined rather than with issue-specific single problems, unquote. Translated from Tavistockian psychobabble into English, Trist is stating that Tavistock does not merely study a large social problem, but intervenes social engagement to bring about a desired result. He continues, the work is future-oriented and concerned with the transition to the post-industrial social order and the paradigm shift which this entails. Devastation, no reflection on what gives us the right to do that, right? That's always the presumption in any oligarchy, or an occulted oligarchy is what it really is. It's not the kind of oligarchy of the ancient world, for instance, where everybody knew who these people were. People don't know who these people are. They think they do, but they don't. We'll get into that another time. Tavistock's work in this area dates back to the 1950s when it conducted studies on the impact of cybernetics on the workforce of industrial countries and on the emergence of the service-oriented economy. In the 1960s, Tavistock operatives conducted studies on the effects of the Kennedy space program on Americans and found that they were contributing to inhibiting the post-industrial shift. British-controlled policy interests moved to shut down the space program. During the 1960s, Tavistock produced a series of reports and papers spelling out how to effect the post-industrial shift. The seminal work was done by Trist himself, who was at the time based in the United States, and his protege, Fred Emery, working out of Tavistock and Australia. Their work is summarized in a 1973 volume, Toward Social Ecology, Contextual Appreciation of the Future in the Present. The problem, quote unquote, confronted by Tristan Emery on behalf of their imperial masters was as follows. For the last 100 years, the world had been governed by the industrial paradigm, in which people saw that application of new technologies has produced a better life for increasing numbers over successive generations. Now, however, we have the emergence from backwardness of the former colonial world, the emerging nations. If they are assimilated into this industrial paradigm, sorry, I read that wrong. The emerging nations, if they are assimilated into this industrial paradigm, will desire the same route to progress in a better life. Problem. Industrial progress thus explicitly threatens the power of the British oligarchy, creating the basis for the establishment of nation-states that oppose continued oligarchical rule. Then we have the Tavistock Center's international nodes. I'll let you find the article and download it, and really you should. It's really a lot in there. Tristan Emery came up with the following answer. If a post-industrial paradigm is imposed on the advanced sector, then it will also define the limits of growth for the developing sector. Since such nations as those in Africa are several decades from being assimilated into the post-industrial paradise, there will be a mixed system of post-industrial advanced countries and semi-industrial and mineral extractive lands in the developing sector, they indicate. This imbalance defines the basis for continued exploitation and control of these areas by the British-dominated world oligarchy. So until we make this shift, it's still going to be necessary to loot and oppress. Unfortunate, but it's got to be done. The question is then posed, how to get society to make what are called in the Tavistock circles Reesian or critical, quote unquote, the opposite of critical, right? Critical choices in which all of the possible choices are bad and lead to a degraded condition, the false choices we're presented with. Tavistock had clinically proven that an individual will make such choices when placed under extreme stress, like 9/11, and most importantly will fail to see the rejection of the parameters of the choice itself as an option. Emery and Trist reported that if society were put through extreme stress, what they termed social turbulence, the appropriate degenerated and psychotic mental states could be induced in the mass of Western population to make a choice, quote unquote, for a post-industrial future. The Tavistock brainwashers spoke of a period of successive social, economic, political, and cultural shocks beginning in the 1960s that would create a vortex-like push of mental states to successively more degenerate levels of defensive adaptation. All of these maladaptive responses, as they call them, are present in the society at the same time, interacting with each other to produce neurotic behaviors on a grand scale. Beautifully put, beautifully written. We see this abundantly clear, right? We can see it all around, those who live in the United States especially. To a world put through terror and stress, a post-industrial future looks bright, they offer. The role of the Tavistock shock troops, say Tristan Emery, is to assist the weary and to bring them over the threshold into the post-industrial age, kind of like Mother Teresa, right? Drug, sex, rock, counterculture. Thus, it should come as no surprise that the British Empire, working largely through Tavistock, was the driving force behind launching the drug, rock, sex counterculture. Tavistock shock troops such as Sir William Sargent and Dr. Ewan Cameron were brought in to lead the Pentagon and the Central Intelligence Agency's 1950s and 60s secret experiments with psychotropic drugs and mind control, known as MK Ultra. Tavistock fellow traveler, emissary, Aldous Huxley, the guru of the 1960s New Age movement, with his book Doors of Perception, right? Which New Age movement was living in Hollywood, working in the motion picture industry and cranking out such works as Brave New World, which decades before the first doses of LSD-25 hit the streets, already advocated societal drugging as the ultimate form of social control. Huxley was even more explicit about his and Tavistock's agenda in a 1961 lecture at the California Medical School in San Francisco, sponsored by the U.S. State Department's Voice of America. Huxley told the crowd of doctors and psychiatrists and government bureaucrats, and this quote is well known, quote, "There will be in the next generation or so a pharmacological method of making people love their servitude and producing dictatorship without tears, so to speak, producing a kind of painless concentration camp for entire societies so that people will in fact have their liberties taken away from them, but will rather enjoy it, because they will be distracted from any desire to rebel by propaganda or brainwashing enhanced by pharmacological methods. And this seems to be the final revolution," unquote. So at that point they will have the human organism completely under control. The hackable animals will be hacked in a final way. Tavistock oversaw the mass drugging of America's college students in the late 1960s, helped launch gangs and counter-gangs, which the zombified youth joined. Meanwhile, Tavistock's in-place network of institutes and clinics, such as Esalen in California, put hundreds of thousands of youths and others through brainwashing sensitivity sessions, quote unquote, as Tavistock created and trained gurus such as Timothy Leary, helped lead the drug-infested masses into the new age. A lot of people still hadn't caught on to Timothy Leary, what he was really about. I see memes and adoring pictures of him with quotes on Facebook every day. It's that subtle, it's that insidious, where people become emotionally attached to these images, these feel-good nostalgia, right? And they can't let go of it, and they can't allow themselves to entertain critical thoughts. At Tavistock, they understand this very, very well. In 1967, Tavistock even sponsored a summer-long brainwashing session in London dubbed Conference on the Dialectics of Liberation. American radicals Angela Davis and Stokely Carmichael were among the participant victims in this session. A generation, once slated to lead the United States and the world into an era of unprecedented progress and prosperity, was thus transformed into a collection of doped-up zombies, change agents, and shock troops for Tavistock's Brave New World. The New Order, Stateless World Fascism. In 1991, Tavistock devoted significant space in its journal Human Relations to the publication of results of a multi-year project on world governance and social change that had been initiated by Trist in the 1980s and involved participants from many Tavistock nodes and its international network. The results of the study must be viewed as a policy recommendation to the imperial elite whom Tavistock serves. Its results can be summarized as follows. The collapse of the Soviet Union as a superpower created new possibilities for world governance and for the full entrance of the world into the post-industrial era. The greatest impediment to that change was the continued existence of the nation-state. As long as the Soviet Union existed, the continuance of nation-based world system in some form was necessary to maintain a balance of power. It were now finally possible to look beyond that form to a new system of world relations. That system, as described in the introductory paper for the for the series by David Cooper-Ryder and William Passmore, the study coordinators from the Case Western Reserve University, is based on, quote, the current transnationalization of world affairs, whereby international relations of the nation-state system have been superseded or supplanted by non-territorial relations among private individuals, groups, and organizations. What is described and proposed is the reformation of the United Nations along lines already well in progress to turn over all operations and key relations to an international network of hundreds of thousands of non-governmental organizations, NGOs, and other groups of varying size, shape, and form. As the study reveals, virtually every one of these groups either traces its origin to the Tavistock network's operatives or is influenced by such operatives. Nearly all key groups have funding connections to either the British oligarchy and its American spores, or should be British oligarchy or its American spores. In many cases, they have direct connections to the House of Lords and its members. The nation state, says Tavistock, made the industrial age possible. Remove it, and the industrial age will die. Replaced by what is called the axial age, to be defined by informal relations, with the main medium of communication between peoples and groups being through computer interface. This is fascinating, right? Such interface, now more commonly known as the internet, can link these disparate groups, which Tavistock calls global social change organizations, and vastly enhance their activities and ease of deployment. There will be resistance to such ideas, say the rapporteurs, coming from the entrenched bureaucracies of the industrial age and the transnational period. For example, the huge multinational corporations which had helped usher in this globalization process must eventually give way to new forms of organizations based on more informal structures. The corporate form, they say, is a relic of the industrial age. Government must become based more on smaller planning groups in local communities tied together by telecommunications. Even the UN, with its cumbersome bureaucracy, must serve more as a forum for such local groups and less as a service to national governments. As for questions of sovereignty, they are soon to become even more meaningless, since the telecommunications internet can pass through any defense, any border. The transition to this new world will not be easy or without suffering, Tavistock indicates. It expects an economic cataclysm as the old system crashes down, but not to worry, the Rhesian shock troops will be there to ease the pain and help us into this brave new world of universal fascism. The typical member of one of these NGOs described in these reports is a zealot, not so unlike a member of cult or Nazi party official. I mean, see wokeism here, right? But one also notices a sickly smile across their faces. Yeah. Even as they are in heated argument, that smile, it has been noted, is the same seen on the victims of Tavistock's brainwashers in their various mind-destroying experiments. The Tavistock grin, as it became known, is the true face of the new world order. And going back, I left out something in the beginning in the introduction, the ability to wage warfare on the mind and to control what people believe and how they think and how they see the world and themselves. Going back to the time of the Venetians, it was the Venetians that started the Protestant Reformation. They, Gasparo Contarini, had an agent, had an asset in Germany, Spalatin, and he was aware of this guy, this monk running around, Martin Luther, and he had a certain outlook, and his work was how his work was published. It was published in Venice. And Gasparo Contarini and his circle promoted Luther and created what ultimately became the 30 Years' War that killed a third to half the population in some parts of Germany, thereby taking the threat that the German states and principalities and little kingdoms posed to the Venetians. The Venetians were always afraid that the, German Holy Roman Empire houses were going to sweep down and into the lagoon and take them out. And so this way, Germany was tied up in killing each other over a completely artificial religious problem. And then Gasparo Contarini turned around and helped promote and create the Jesuits. So he was in charge of both the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. And it was at that very crucial, that absolutely vile and destructive exercise of this capability to control people's minds, that I think the creation of religious warfare, this is essentially the Venetian method. And you have now the empire, the modern empire, the international deep state, whatever you want to call it, exercising, waging that kind of warfare on populations. We all know the term dumbing down. That's just one aspect of it. Affecting our health. We see in COVID. Degenerate forms of entertainment, degeneration of academia. It's all a form of menticide. So we'll get into Tavistock, some specific operations in the next video or so, and keep going. I think it's really vital. I think this is really the crucial. This is what each of us can focus on, and I encourage you all to take time every day and reflect on your own, on those vast, infinite inner resources that we all have, and sweep aside all of the cobwebs and things that bind us, beliefs, ideologies, philosophies. Take a little time away from all of it and think really independently. Look at the world from a very fresh, unconditioned state of mind. I'm not talking about a formal kind of meditation here. I'm talking about something much more primal. So anyway, thanks for listening.